buy a bag or just make a donation at the information tent. And we are very lucky today to have with us as our interviewer George Gibson, who is the executive editor of Grove Atlantic, a leading American publisher, and he is on the Book Festival Advisory Committee panel. So thank you, George, for your work on our behalf here. And our author is Madeleine Blais. Her book is called To the New Owners. I don't know about you, but I've been hearing about it from a lot of people in my life saying you have to read this book. Madeleine Blais is a professor of journalism at UMass Amherst. She was a reporter for the Boston Globe, the Trenton Times, and the Miami Herald, where she won a Pulitzer Prize for feature writing. So thank you for being here, and we look forward to the discussion.
Okay, so is this on? Can you hear okay? Okay, great. First of all, a couple of shout-outs, and you may do your own shouting out, but to Sue Ellen Lazarus and to all of you who have put this festival together, it's been fascinating to see it grow over the years. May it continue growing. I mean, this is becoming a major literary festival, and I go to a lot of them. This is as well run as any I've been to around the country, so props to all of you. And secondly, to start with a publishing story. It is always a bit traumatic for authors when their editors leave. And this happened to Maddie because her editor for To the New Owners, a wonderful young man named Jameson Stoltz, left Grove Atlantic last November. And that's the point at which the book was just beginning to get published. So it's a very traumatic thing for an author to have an editor leave because the editor-author relationship is a really close one, and they worked really hard on the book. I left the job that I had at Grove Atlantic, at Bloomsbury last November, and I joined Grove Atlantic in mid-January. And I inherited Maddie. Now, it's traumatic for an author to be inherited by another editor. It is also mildly traumatic for an editor to inherit an author because I wasn't there at the start of this book, and I don't know all the stories behind it, and I didn't know Maddie at all. And I can tell you that one of the great joys that I've had in joining Grove Atlantic, and these are the questions that I was going to ask Maddie, so I better pick them up, is getting to know her. And that's part of what makes this book special, too. There is a great intimacy and a great warmth in Madeleine Blais. I have come to greatly appreciate that over the last few months, and you will find that in her book. So the trauma that I had was completely dissipated. I'm praying that the trauma that Maddie had has been marginally dissipated by my being there. But we're certainly having fun publishing the book. And let me start, Maddie, by just saying, many of the people in this audience know the book, but talk about the inspiration for it just to start with and set the scene for it a little bit, and then we'll go on from there.
Okay, thank you, George. Key word, inheritance. He used it 2 or 3 times.
Yeah.
This book is about an inheritance, a house on Tisbury Great Pond in a location that I will not describe in detail, but just to say that it was on a peninsula on the pond. It led to the ocean, a beautiful piece of land. And the house on that property had been owned by my husband's family. My husband is named John Katzenbach. He's a thriller writer. His father was Nicholas Katzenbach, well known as the Attorney General of the United States during the Kennedy Johnson years. And he's the one who stood in the schoolhouse store at the University of Alabama and told George Wallace that he had to segregate that university. And George Wallace did. When John's father died in 2012, ownership reverted to the 4 children, and we realized that the house was then on its own kind of life support system because 3 of the siblings lived on the West Coast. We were the only ones on the East Coast in Massachusetts, in Amherst, and therefore the only ones who could really have access to the house on a somewhat routine basis without a lot of rigmarole and travel, et cetera. And the others all, frankly, just wanted to cash out, take the money, use it for all the mundane things that most of our money goes to, which is back taxes, college loans, mortgages, this and that, maybe helping your kids with a down payment, whatever. And that was that. So once the house was in the market, we knew that we were going to lose it. And in fact, in the summer of 2014, some people made an offer that, as a friend of ours said, a friend who was an editor at Fortune magazine, Mr. Market has spoken. The offer seemed fair and square. Family accepted it, and the house was about to be sold. John and I were because we were on the East Coast, we were the ones left holding the bag, so to speak. So that entire summer, which was a very fraught summer for the world. I have a paragraph in here, a couple of paragraphs about all the terrible things that summer, up to and including Robin Williams' suicide and the immigrant children being warehoused in Texas and planes shot over the Ukraine. Just it's the usual despondent landscape that we seem to live with these days. Just it happened to be that summer's version. So I knew that, the world was in turmoil, and yet I was feeling this avalanche of mixed feelings about this process and thought I was maybe being a spoiled brat. Like, why did I feel so bad? Or was it bad to feel so bad? And finally I thought, no, this house and the summers we had spent there, which was 2 weeks every summer, 14 days that I usually managed to parlay into 17 by, greeting other people who were coming in and making sure they had a couple of meals and got a couple, you squeeze an extra day or two. But it was 2 weeks every summer for about 40 years. And I just felt that it had, for us, this enormous meaning. It was a place, a dependable riff in our lives, the place where we kind of were better than usual, better than our usual selves, maybe more joyful, more open to nature, more open to just slowing down. It was an unplugged house. In fact, when the Katzenbachs first bought the property, on it was one of those old fishing shacks that were used by sea captains in Edgartown when they wanted to get away from their families. They'd go out to Tisbury Great Pond with a gun and some booze, and they'd shoot the geese. And there may have been a girl or two involved from time to time, who knows. Anyway, that shack was the original property. It got torn down. In '78, a new house got put up. Still modest, no electricity. There was running water, no washer, no dryer, no television ever. A portable radio that sometimes got scratchy sounds about the Boston Red Sox late at night that people would listen to. So it was a very calm and calming place. And I wanted to capture that. I wanted somehow words to replace what I was going to lose in fact. And so that was part of the impulse to write the book.
What's it like and talk a little bit about what it's like to write about memory. The challenge of recalling scenes that took place years ago and trying to make sure that they're as accurate as they could be. The pleasures that memory evokes for you. Talk a bit about writing about memory, because this book is so much about memory.
One of my favorite memoirs is Tobias Wolff's This Boy's Life. And at the beginning, he has a sentence or two where he says, this is a book of memory, and it tells the best story that memory can tell. When you're relying on memory, you're relying on an instrument that can be somewhat unreliable. I always say it's made at times out of fog, mist, and quicksand. So one thing that I try to do when I summon a memory is also try to actually research my own memories if I can. I believe in the kind of reported memoir that is somewhat popular these days, where people will write what they remember and then try to, if they can verify any of it, they try to. Just try to get to the best version of the truth you can manage to convey. So in this particular work, I had a lot of excellent allies in the process. One thing is that the Katzenbach family are all born storytellers, and they would tell wonderful stories, the same stories over and over, so I could access those quite readily. But more cogently, when the new house was built in '78, the new house, which is the one we sold, we bought some ship's logs from a place called AGA Correas and Sons in Maine, and these are beautiful 8x11 books with a sturdy cover that are used, in fact, as nautical logs on boats. And the paper is plain; it's not lined, so people can actually draw what things that they want to draw on them if they wish. And we would write in these logs. Some of the entries were complete drivel, or as someone put it, cheesy teenage blah. And, odes to the flora and the fauna, and, I've never seen a more beautiful day, or whatever, okay. But then other people really amped it up and wrote either beautiful things or just captured a quote or a moment or a recipe or something that became almost like a Madeleine, like a wafer that would, you just look at these words, these few words, and they would just bring back an entire, say, funeral service for a beautiful woman who died too young, that kind of thing. And I use those logs to inspire me to remember scenes that had happened long ago.
And those logs also contained operating manual for the house, which is pretty funny, actually, because every house is quirky and has things that you probably don't want people to discover, but they need to know about.
Yeah.
So,
Well, this house, I don't know. The houses in the vineyard vary from places that are really quite sturdy and posh to places that are really kind of sketchy. I mean, this house reverted to nature in some ways. It was weather beaten. It was really beaten by the weather. And it seemed no matter how hard we tried to fortify it and to repair different items in it, we never got ahead of the game. And part of the problem is, though, that everyone in John's family basically are word people, therapists, lawyers, writers, the kind of people that can't really figure out how to fix things. Actually, one of our frequent guests is in the audience right now, Peter, who actually knew how to fix things. One time he fixed a Volvo in the driveway that wouldn't start. That got pages and pages in the log. Someone had actually come to the house and fixed something. So.
if you can recall, other than your family, and I want you to talk about in particular Lydia later, but if you could recall 3 memorable people you've met on the vineyard, apart from your family, who would they be, and can you tell a vignette about them?
Okay. All right. I'm just gonna free associate a little bit.
Free associate.
One person that I always liked saying hello to during the 2 weeks we were here, and I'd see her quite frequently because we ate a lot of seafood, was Sandy, who owns John's Fish Market. Do you know her? And just this, every time I saw her, she gave me a smile, and especially as Nick and Lydia, my in-laws, became too frail to come to the island, or too frail to, even if they were here, to go to the store to get the seafood. She always asked about them with great kindness. And at one point, I was buying one of her loaves of Portuguese sweetbread, and I said, "Boy, I really would like to learn how to make this." And she said, "Well, you can come to my house sometime and I'll teach you," which I haven't done, but I have her number. And I think I'm going to ask her if I can do that. So that's one person. Another person who meant, well, there was a sad day one summer. If anyone knows Tisbury Great Pond, you know that sometimes a cut is open from the pond to the ocean to replenish the water in the pond and to make it fresh again so that the seafood can thrive. And we went to the beach on the day the cut was open. It wasn't being really guarded correctly by the officials. After this terrible incident, things changed. But a man had walked to the beach that day. He was a teacher in the high school. His name was Louis Toscano. And he was on a health kick. He was trying to walk. I think he was giving up cigarettes. He had a backpack with him with a book in it and some water, such. And he was just going to have a day at the beach in August. And he was at the cut and observing it. He got too close to the edge and slipped down on the sand and got washed away in a second, just right in front of our eyes. You saw him rapidly moving out to sea. People noticed right away, the men on the beach particularly like this. No, there was one person with a cell phone. That's how long ago it was. They called the Coast Guard. The men ran to the pond, got boats, carried them as quickly as they could to the ocean side, and then moved as strongly and as quickly as they could to try to find him in the water. And people were pointing, but it was to no avail. And later, when the obituary came out in the Gazette, I learned, did anyone know him? He was in the audience. Anybody's children go to the high school? It said that he taught math, but he knew Dante in the original Italian and would just recite it to the kids. He had one of the kids that he helped was a salutarian or valedictorian at the high school and went on to Duke. That was a great source of pride. And many people became teachers because of him. But the moment that was even more heartbreaking was a few weeks after this terrible loss. Some men came onto the beach, 2 or 3 men dressed in street clothes, so, shirts and ties and shoes. And they were walking around from towel to towel asking people if they had been there that day, because they were trying to figure out what had happened, trying to reconstruct the events. And they were the brothers of this apparently wonderful man asking why. So I always wished I could have met him. And the other person that is another person in the book who actually gets her own chapter is Catherine Graham. The chapter is called What Kay Graham Brought to the Table. Catherine Graham was on the island, as I'm sure some of you know, for many, many years in a house called Mohu in Lambert's Cove. for various reasons, partly because of my newspaper life, we were at a funeral service for someone we both loved, and she said, "Oh, you're going to the vineyard, Maddie. When you're there, please be sure to give me a call." And I said, "Oh my God, I really will have to call her. Wait on me. Let me tell you, I got to the island. I got to call Mrs. Graham. This is crazy." And so I did call her, and I didn't know what would happen, but I thought I really should call. And she wanted to have lunch or dinner, and as it turned out, we would have a meal together once a summer, low key. We were not on the B list. I think we were on the T list or something, but that was good. It was very intimate, really, and I found her to be a very engaging person who seemed to particularly want to engage with people of all ages, and she would come to our house. I remember once she came and we made lobster because I thought, well, that's down home. We'll put a bib on everybody. You know, the lobster juices will fly everywhere. It'll be a casual time. But my favorite meal was a couple years later when it was our turn. I went to John's Fish Market and got harpooned swordfish. You guys know how expensive that is. You know how good it is. And you probably, if you're like me, also honor local food for its integrity, and you don't want to do too much to it. So my way of cooking really, really good swordfish is to take just store-bought mayonnaise and put the tiniest membrane of mayo on the top and the bottom, and then put it on the grill at a fairly high heat so that the exterior sears and gets crispy, and the interior, continues to cook, and it's very delicious as well. She loved my swordfish. That's good. She wanted my recipe. She wanted me to talk to her chef about the recipe. And I remember thinking, I had to think quickly, and I finally said, "Mrs. Graham, I would love to share this recipe with you, but first you have to tell me who Deep Throat is." And she went, "Oh, my dear," So, but anyway, one really cool thing is that chapter was excerpted in Vanity Fair, and as a result of that, I've been following what seems to be a resurgence of interest in Katharine Graham, and it turns out that I believe it's already been filmed. It just hasn't been released. There's going to be a film based. Do you know about this? It is okay. Meryl Streep is playing Katharine Graham, and Tom Hanks is playing Ben Bradley. Yeah. And is it called The Papers? Something like that. But anyway, so what's really good is there are so many young people, even the young people I teach in journalism at the University of Massachusetts, who they know about Watergate. They've heard of Watergate. They have kind of heard of Woodward and Bernstein. Sometimes they say, "Is that a musical comedy team?" They're not always sure. But a lot of them have not really at this point, unless I've stood on my head, heard who Katharine Graham is. So she's going to get a nice a new audience, which will be good.
So in that Vanity Fair, I don't know if any of you saw the excerpt of Maddie's book that was in Vanity Fair, but there's a fascinating photograph, a celebrity photograph of people who were on the vineyard. One of whom was in that photograph was Alan Dershowitz. So I have to ask you to tell the Alan Dershowitz story because it is a howl. And anyway,
so,
over to you.
All right. So did anyone go hear Scott Simon earlier today talking about the Cubs? Yeah. He interviewed me for Morning Edition, which is really, it was a wonderful thing to have happen. I was very excited about that. You don't go into Washington for that. You go to your local NPR station, and they set you up in a studio and it all. You guys have probably done this. I mean, it's the Vineyard. Everyone knows NPR by heart. He's talking about the book, nice questions, this and that. And finally he comes to this paragraph that he starts reading. And he's reading it at length. And it's a list of celebrities that people had said they'd seen over the years while we were here and written about them in the log. Just saying they'd cited Patricia Neal, the actress, in Vineyard Haven, Meg Ryan dining, JFK Jr. buying a donut at Humphreys on his bicycle. Just this, this person, that person. And finally it said Alan Dershowitz on the nude beach on his cell phone. And while this guy is reading this to me, I'm thinking, this is a sop of a paragraph. It really is not. It's just listing celebrities. It's not even. I just had it in there because I felt I had to have something about celebrities, And where is he going to go with this? And he said to me, on the interview, he said, I'm just so curious. After Alan Dershowitz got off the phone, where did he put his cell phone? And I'm thinking, good Catholic girl, I can't even answer that question. So all I said was, I only observed him from a distance.
So jumping back in time, before you knew John, you came to the vineyard at one point before you knew John and his family. What was your very first memory of the vineyard? Can you remember what you first took away from that first visit to the vineyard, and does that still exist?
Well, actually, the first time I came to the island was in the early 70s as a newspaper reporter. And I went to a party that was in honor of a book by Barbara Tuchman, who was a pro-environmentalist and was writing a book that was getting great notice. It was a typical vineyard book party, though I didn't know it at that time. Lots of white wine and lots of opinions, and lots of people who were very prominent. And some of them I hadn't even heard of. Some, of course, I had, but I was trying to get their names straight and not act too dumb. But the great coup from my point of view was that at one point someone my age showed up, who I recognized. It was Carly Simon, and she came in. She was pregnant, I think, with her first child. And what I remember she said, because I took it down and put it in the piece that I wrote, was, "I can't believe it. It took forever to get here. There was a traffic jam at 5 corners," as if that, because it had never happened before, but at that point in the history of the island. So I wrote that down, and while I was writing it down, I kept thinking, I can't wait to go back home and tell everybody I interviewed the "You're So Vain" girl. So.
Now that you don't have this house and you don't come here every year, does the vineyard seem different to you in any way? I mean, you've been away from it now you haven't had the house for 3 years. You've come back, not irregularly, but does the vineyard somehow seem different because you don't have that firm linkage?
I feel that the purchase on the island is gone, literally. The house is gone. But psychologically, I feel very confident here, and I like it. The feeling that I know how to do the ferry. I know how to go to get the rental car. I know how to find these roads. I know where Menemsha is. I know that when people start giving you directions and they say, "Well, turn at the red mailbox," you go, "No. There are millions of red mailboxes. Find another marker." You know what I mean? So I feel as if when I'm on the island, that I have a certain expertise that has not vanished, and I'm grateful for that. And I have great memories and love of the island, as everyone here does. I think that goes without saying.
Can you talk a little bit about the writers who inspire you? You mentioned Toby Wolfe's memoir earlier. And also maybe in the process, talk about the writing of memoir versus other kinds of writing, because you're also engaged in doing research on a biography, I know. There's journalism in your future as well, and has been in your past. Talk a little bit about the different styles of writing and those people who have influenced you.
Well, I'm a great fan of memoir because I think it's where so many roads converge. Memory, desire, reporting, narrative, journalism. It is all those things at once. It's a lot of poets and essayists turn to memoir for a kind of truthful version of reality. But in terms of writing, I'm a nonfiction writer by trade and training. However, I really like to read novels, and the book that I'm reading really carefully right now is a book called The Ninth Hour by a woman named Alice McDermott, who is based in Washington. She teaches at Johns Hopkins and is a wonderful writer. And I really like, my thing is, I really like careful writing. I like books that are perfectly alive, even at the sentence level or the word level. So that's what I look for in what I read. Yeah.
I'm always interested in the craft of writing, and I despair of writing anything at length myself. I find it challenging to write 2 paragraphs of catalog copy and make them really good. So I am hugely admiring of authors who can put tens and tens of thousands of words together. What is it that scares you about writing? Is there anything that is when you sit down to and this is not a blank page, but let's assume that was a blank page and you're trying to fill it. Does anything scare you in that process?
Well, I don't know about. I know there are other writers in this room, and I don't know. So I don't know if you feel this way, but I do. Sometimes I feel a little bit of despair when I write something and I realize I've made the same mistakes over and over, and it's okay because I have time on my side, I can fix them. But I actually get scared about using adverbs. Shouldn't use adverbs, basically. So if I see myself using adverbs or a weak adjective or over and over, the construction there was, or anything that feels like a false note or clumsy note. I think I'm too old for this. I should be able to do this really smoothly. And often, especially in my first drafts, they're pretty messy. So I think that that's one of the things that I find the hardest in some ways, is just always feeling that you have to do your personal best, and it's not always easy.
What's your writing process? I mean, do you write obviously on every day or almost every day when you're involved in a book, but do you try to get a first draft down very quickly and then massage it from there? Gay Talese, for example, is sort of famously says he will write 2 pages a day, and then he will not move on to the next page until he feels those 2 pages are perfect, which may explain why he's about a decade late on his new book. But what's your process? Do you want to get it all down once and then look at it and revise it, or do you edit as you go along?
I do both. There's a phrase that I heard a writer say years ago at a conference like this, who said you have to be able to tolerate the ambiguity. And that means to me, it means you have to be able to tolerate the ambiguity, that just you're not sure of what you want to say. You have to be able to tolerate that you're not saying it correctly. You have to be able to, at the end of the day, think you accomplished something, and then know the next morning when you go back to look at it that it wasn't what it should be, and you have to say, okay, I have to detangle this, I have to change this around. But you have to be able to revise. I think that's the big thing. And with someone like Gay Talese, or the writers who have to make it word perfect to go on, that's a really slow writing process. And I'm glad that I'm capable at times of being way sloppier than that, because there's more you have more to play with if you've just produced pages. Even if they're not very good, you could produce pages and pages, but there's maybe one phrase that you end up saving. You go, okay, well that was a yield,
There are, I know, writers who feel that the advent of the personal computer, i.e. being able to write on a computer, has made writing easier and also longer. In other words, you put down everything so quickly, where David McCullough, for example, still writes on a manual typewriter, and which is a harder thing, obviously, to manipulate than a computer. Do you write by hand at all? I know some writers who still like to write out by hand, at least write out difficult passages by hand and sort of work through them that way.
No, but I do. I don't really write by hand very much. However, I do keep a calendar, which is hardback, and it has the days in pretty big blocks. And sometimes, if there's an overheard quote or something that occurs to me, I'll keep it as part of a daily diary. And so I do have notes that I take by hand. Yeah. That I use from time to time and go back to. But I find at this point that just the computer is much easier to use. So.
Yeah, no, it is.
You mentioned Lydia. I want to just
please,
say something.
I was about to ask you that.
I just want to say a little more about my husband's family versus mine, because it might explain maybe some of the feeling I had for this place and for this time. John and I come from very different families. His was, as I said, very prominent, father very accomplished. His mother was also accomplished in her own right. She came from an old family, the Stokes-Phelps family. 2 old families, really. Her family used to go to the Adirondacks, and one of her relatives, a great uncle or something, invented most of the rules for international yachting competitions. And at one point I remember learning that and just hearing John's brother, the lawyer, say, most, why not all? There was a sense of privilege in that family. Lydia rebelled, John's mother, and as I always say, she was like FDR. She couldn't wait to be a traitor to her class. When she was 8 years old, she got a school report in which the teacher wrote, Lydia is a natural leader, but in the wrong direction. A report that thrilled her. It happens that today is her 95th birthday. On her birthday, in the old days, especially when she was still feeling much more vital than she is right now, she would give up something she didn't like doing. So it was like Lent in reverse. Whatever it was, if she didn't want to go to big dinner parties or something, whatever, I don't know, it could be anything. And you never knew what it was going to be. In the logs, at one point, there's a lovely little, I love this particular passage. She praises Marilyn Robinson's Gilead. Is that what you're going to say?
Gilead, yeah.
Gilead. And she said, she was sort of somewhat anti-religion, so she said, who would have believed it? A whole novel told in the voice of a minister, the voice of God throughout, and it's absolutely terrific. So she loved that book. She would always have interesting takes on the world. When I met John's parents, I expected to be intimidated by his father because of his father's dossier. But his father was kind of a teddy bear, kind of a mild-mannered man who really wanted people to feel comfortable. He did radiate gravitas. So if you asked to say, please pass the butter, it was really good if you could also maybe talk about the Constitution or some recent headline at the same time. You didn't want to waste his time. But Lydia was what you would call a force of nature. And one of the chapters in the book is about her. And what I always say is there's an old saying that I picked up somehow from William Butler Yeats that no man shows a greater courage, a more reckless courage, than to enter the abyss of his self and write about himself. I would say that no woman shows a greater, more reckless courage than to write about her mother-in-law when she is alive, sentient, and capable of revenge. So this particular chapter was one of my favorites to write because I felt that I'd been given the gift of time to see her in the round and to try to understand her much more clearly than when I was simply intimidated by her or trying to hold my own, with her or against her or whatever. And there are two pieces of writing of hers that are in the book. One is a letter she wrote to my son when he was about 8, when he wanted nothing more than a BB gun. So when his parents said no, he went to the grandparents. That's the Supreme Court for kids, tries to get an appellate ruling on it. She wrote the most beautiful letter trying to understand what it would be like to be an 8-year-old boy wanting this more than anything and not really being able to get it and how you deal with that. When she was in Washington, she was a famous hostess and much desired. It was very desirable to be on her guest list. One time she had dinner for Princess Margaret. And the reason that came about was Princess Margaret's people asked the State Department to go to a typical American family, as if these were the typical American family was my family. I came from a family of 6 kids, and this wasn't particularly typical, but my father died when I was 5. So my mother had 5 kids, 8 and under, and was pregnant. I always say he died suddenly of cancer, which is really what happened in the early 50s. But we were, I come from what I call an all bets are off childhood. We worshiped the Kennedys. The Katzenbachs knew them. When my husband was young, he got to go to see PT 109 at the White House, just with a group of young Kennedy kids or whomever. We would honestly live to go to the basement at the Immaculate Heart of Mary Church for the all-you-can-eat spaghetti dinner. So different kinds of childhoods. And with Lydia, because of her upbringing and the privilege that she had, she could have just sailed through life as a hostess and just had that life. But something hit her, and I don't even know what it is exactly, but towards the end of the 60s, she went into psychoanalysis, and it deepened her and caused her to want to become a lay psychoanalyst, which means that you have extensive training, but you're not a doctor. So she ended up being a therapist. And one of the letters that I quote of hers in the book she shared with me without any obviously identifying details, was to the parents of a young child, a girl, college age, who'd come back from a year abroad or semester abroad and was really done in by drugs, something bad. And the letter addresses these parents and says, you must look at your child as the whole person. Because if you look at the child as a disaster, catastrophe, that's what gets mirrored back to this young person, and that's what they internalize. You must remember them in their fullness and their glory. And this letter, one of the people who helped me copy edit the book, had a relative who is in Narcotics Anonymous because of a relative suffering through heroin addiction. She brought this letter to the meeting, and basically it got Xeroxed by everybody. They loved it so much. So there's a real wisdom in this woman who it would have been easy enough for me also to dismiss as someone who'd just been lucky in life and, had her husband attorney general, gave parties in Washington for Princess Margaret, had a house in the vineyard, but there was so much more there. So that was one of the real thrills of writing the book.
Well, a couple more questions, and then we'll throw it open to you guys. So switching gears a little bit to your professorial life. You teach journalism on a regular basis, and so you're encountering young people wanting to get into the business that is more and more being labeled as fake news. And an industry that somebody might think is not worth entering today. And yet, I remember you were saying yesterday at the panel that you were enormously impressed by the students that come into your door. To talk a little bit about them and where you feel, they may be able to take journalism in the years to come.
I teach journalism at University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and as I said yesterday, is a UMass person? Yay! 3 years ago, we actually did get a new building. No one ever gets a new building, ever. But I hung in there, and I got a new building in my work life. And so we have this fantastic state-of-the-art building with, really good broadcast studios for the kids and perfectly wonderful computer labs, et cetera. And we are attracting kids who are extremely fierce. They self-select. They really want to change the world through journalism. They believe in it. They believe in the process. They're 100% for the First Amendment. They're taught ethics. They're taught media literacy. They're on the ground. They've got good jobs. They have internships. They're working on the student media. So they are very inspiring, to say the least. I also teach, if anybody here is ever thinking about wanting to write a book and needs help with it, I teach at Goucher College in the low residency MFA program, and people who are out of college at different stages of life, up to and through their 70s, apply to this program. And if they get in, they come for 4 semesters, 10 days on the ground, and then work with a different mentor, 4 semesters in a row. And at the end, they have a thesis, which is also hopefully a book. So I do that as well. So I don't spend all my time writing. I'd be crazy if I did, because then you have to spend all your time thinking about what people think of your writing, which is really the path of madness. So I like teaching too. It gives me a nice firewall and gives me something to give. I feel like I'm giving back. And as people keep looking at me and saying, "Have you retired yet?" And I just say, "I will," but I just keep forgetting to turn in the paperwork. Yeah. So.
Questions from any of you?
I know what that is.
Thank you very much. I finished reading your book today. I savored it. It was fantastic, and it caused me to have some wonderful conversations with my family. We rent, we don't own. And I asked at dinner just before my 30-year-old son just turned 30, was returning to Manhattan. I said, what is it here? What is it about the vineyard for you? We didn't write logs, but I wanted to know. We used to just spend 1 week of each summer here. And he said, where else can I be where I can suddenly be 10 years old again? And I'm listening to you talk. I was reading your book. I have tears in my eyes because it was very moving. And I was on the beach with my cell phone making a list of all the story
Presumably
headings.
you didn't see Alan Dershowitz there.
No, she wasn't on the nude beach.
No, thank goodness. But
All of us feel that way.
I made a list of sort of the chapter headings if we had a family log, and it's just enriched my experience and my time here. And I cannot thank you enough
Well,
for this beautiful book.
Thank you so much. I wanted to say one of the young people. That's very, very beautiful. Thank you. One of the young people, very young, wrote in the log, maybe a 10 or 11-year-old at one point. Thank you for letting me visit. While I'm on the vineyard, I'm having the kind of childhood people had before I was born. That's all.
Hi, Maddie. When I went to journalism school at UMass, and I was inspired by Woodward and Bernstein. And I wanted to follow up on one of George's questions about journalism today. Do you see a resurgence of interest in journalism, given some of the great work that's being done now by the Times and the Post and all that's going on?
Absolutely. I think, it's one of the ironies, unintended consequences. Trump will probably restore journalism to its rightful glory more than any other force. So we will be grateful to him when he's out of office, and we can look at it from hindsight and just be happy with how things have changed. But I really do think that he's bullies everybody, but the bullying of journalists. I know somebody who's a journalist who works for Politico, who is very like a lot of reporters, sees through the process on both sides, but ended up voting for Hillary. Didn't really like her very much, but he really hated the way Trump's people would taunt reporters. And at one point, I think they were yelling at him, "How many shekels does your boss pay you?" This kind of thing. Just like mean, stupid, evil things. And he ended up, he didn't love Hillary at all, but that she got his vote because, he just felt that the rancor is it's beyond measure. And but it is creating a fuel amongst young people and even people my age to try to keep the fires flaming for good journalism.
Hi. Just curious if you had read, I can't think of the author's name, but The Big House.
Yes, George Colt.
Yeah, thank you. And if you had taken any inspiration from that book before you started yours, and then once you started yours, if you took any guidance from the way he shaped that book.
Yeah. George Colt wrote The Big House. It's about a house on the Cape that was in his family for over 100 years. A big cottage, with lots of annexes and secret rooms and lots of Brahmin Boston history attached to it. And actually, I had started writing about the vineyard long before I wrote this book, and I know George, and I remember when his book came out thinking, well, that's it. That's the book. But it's first of all, it's the Cape. It's not the vineyard. We know they're not the same. And his is a really wonderful social history of his family, partly. And that was not, I would say that this book is a lot about the vineyard and a stealth memoir of my husband's family, but not a social history of his immediate family. Yeah.
And here's an interesting twist on George Colt, who gave a wonderful quote for Maddie's book. And I got an email from him one day, and he said, "Are you the same George Gibson that taught me tennis 35, 40 years ago up in Franconia, New Hampshire?" And indeed I am. I mean, a lot of circles in this business. You can now see why I feel so grateful to have inherited Maddie Blais.
I'm good. They were about to end it, so I figured I would.
Maddie will be signing books over there in the tent right afterwards, so go buy books.